Okay, my students, today we're going to talk a little bit about the Native American tribes of Texas, and so this is going to be a great overview for you. We've already talked about the land bridge, and as you can see with my little clicker and pointer here, the initial migration into North America and South America came this way. Eventually, we'll start talking about how the Europeans colonized North America and South America, and as a result, they brought more Europeans over, and of course, this had a great impact on the Texas Native Americans, and in general, the Native Americans in North and South America as a whole, because as part of the Great Columbian Exchange, which you'll learn later down the road, the Native Americans were going to die from disease, and that's one important factor that you need to know, is that the Native Americans in Texas and around in North and South America died in the millions as a result of disease. So let's focus on this. As you can see, if you were thinking about the four regions of Texas, here is the mountain and basin region. Here is the Great Plains. Here is the Central Plains that we've talked about the last couple of days. And then along here is the coastal region that we briefly talked about with the Gulf of Mexico sitting right here. The tribes of the mountain basin, there are actually two. There's the Juanos and the Tiguas. Okay, both of these Native American cultures were very small. They pretty much stayed in their local area. They really didn't do too much as far as traveling outside, and eventually they would become extinct, especially the Pueblos, as a result of the Spanish exploration into that area. Jumanos, well, each one had a village chief, and who was responsible for settling the problems. We're not quite sure how they governed themselves. And of course, there were two real groups. One was a hunter-gatherer and that tended to trade, and then the other group of Jumanos were basically agricultural. They farmed in large villages along the Rio Grande, using the water and raising corn and vegetables. And so they pretty much stayed in their area. And of course, they lived in the West Texas area, near El Paso and in the Big Bend area that we talked about. And they lived in homes made of adobe that we called pueblos. And adobes are basically clay and grass mixed with water and then hardened and made into bricks. And then the sun dried them, and then they went and made their pueblos or their houses out of this. Extremely very efficient in using the land itself. The Tiguas, as you can also see, again, they were led by a chief who also served as a medicine man. The chief advised by a governor or war chief and four captains, and so they tended to go out and hunt, and they farmed vegetables, and of course, like I said, they lived in the El Paso area. And pretty much the Tiguas and the Jumanos, they worked well with each other. I don't think there was too much warfare going between the two tribes, but they certainly were threatened by the Apaches and the Comanches as the Apaches moved into the Great Plains and started threatening the Jumanos and Tiguas. The Tiguas situation was made from adobe, and that's what I told you about earlier. And here's a good example of a pueblo that still exists somewhat today. The tribes of the Great Plains, most of them were the Comanches and Apaches. The Kiowas, they were all pretty much, after the Spanish came, horseback riders. And so that's where the Native American lore begins in Texas. The Comanches, they basically were loose bands organized under a chief. The families all worked together. The chief basically proved himself by his age and his skill and his wisdom, and more or less became a great warrior. Their economy was centered around hunting, gathering, small gathering. The women gathered, the men hunted, and they typically hunted for buffalo, deer, and wild turkeys. And they lived in the Great Plains. And how they lived in this area here, the Apaches and the Kiowa, they all kind of sort of lived off of teepees, which were man-made and able to be very mobile. They basically, the sticks that held the teepees up were basically carried by the horses, or pulled by the horses, okay? And of course, all of the buffalo hides sat and kind of raised right on that wood. As you can see, some of these are the great tribe people. And so they also translated their name to be the Navajo are the enemy, and they did have quite a few enemies in that area. They were not well liked by all of the other tribes because of their warlike nature, but they did migrate, and they were very nomadic, and they ranged anywhere from West Texas all the way to the coastal plains, and sometimes when they were hunting and coming in conflict with those that were more staying close to their own villages. The tribes of the North Central Plains, well, one of them is the Wichitas. The Comanches were also there. And if you go out west of Wichita Falls, you can probably see where the Comanches and the Kiowa roamed. And of course, they hunted buffalo, and believe it or not, Texas did have elk and bear at one time, and they collected wild plants. So they were always in kind of sort of in conflict with all of the other mobile tribes of Texas. The tribes of the coastal plains, well, they were the Caddos, the Attakapas, the Karankawas, and the Coquitiquans. Can't even say it today, sorry. Coquitiquans. Anyway, so forgive me on that. You guys are probably having a good laugh on that Coach Flynn can't pronounce that one today. These tribes loved the alligator for their hides, their meat, and their oils. And so the Caddos were definitely farm-based. They believed in raising corn and other plants, pumpkin and stuff. So and this is where that whole ceremonial peace pipe began. They built their burial grounds, kind of some of the largest ones, or what we call the Caddos were Mississippian tribes. And they built burial grounds that can still be seen today. They look like little hillsides. They banded together in kin-based groups or organized in a confederacy, and they were led by a council of great men. And of course, they were tanners, and they believed in trade. And they did trade very high up, all the way up into the Ohio River Valley area. This is what the Caddos are most famous for, their homes. It's almost conical in shape. And so I want you to understand that's a really interesting aspect you can notice. And then, of course, if you look at the top, that's where the smoke came from if they were using a fire inside there. They traced their lines through the mother's side, the matriarch, so that's kind of interesting. And they created this confederacy and lived in these lovely beehive grass huts. The Attakapas, well, they were small bands that lived right on the coast near Louisiana. They were fishermen, they were hunters, they were gatherers. They lived in East Texas and West Louisiana, and they lived in small lodges made out of grass and reeds. And so unfortunately, when they came in contact with the Europeans, they became extinct. Again, another ones, the Karankawas, they were the dog lovers. They based their stuff out of living off the coast, but they did move in during the winter inland, and they hunted for the deer and other animals that were very abundant in that area. They used dugout canoes to fish out in the Gulf, and trading and hunting was one of their big things that kept their tribes alive. Additionally, like I'd like to say, these people ate so well. They were very large, very tall people. And if you go to the down to the Bullock Museum in Austin, you can actually see one of their dugout canoes. And of course, the Karankawas did work in scattered groups. They used smoke signals, hence that old Indian lore that you could see smoke signals very far. They traveled in bands of 30 to 40, and of course, they were somewhat poorly equipped, and so I want you to understand that. And then the last tribe that I want to talk to you about is the Coquitiquans. And I'll go ahead and put a pronunciation in there for you in the Google Classroom. But one of the big tribes that was always broken up into smaller nomadic tribes, and the reason for that was because they were living off of basically snakes and insects. Their diet wasn't very well, and so they were naturally a little bit smaller than most of the Native Americans, and they were probably the first group to actually be absorbed into the Spanish culture and theory, and were part of the mainstay of most of the great missions down in San Antonio that we're most known, that San Antonio is most known for. And of course, they did hunt and they did forage. They lived in the South Texas area, and but they did range up into the northern Mexico, and so but they did live in one of the poorest regions of Texas, and so that's the reason why they struggled so much. Again, they believed that the women worked a lot because the men were constantly always in search of food, and their huts were typically made of mud or animal skins or brush. And of course, they became very extinct early in the Spanish colonization process. Some of the big key takeaways that you need to consider is how did they survive? What group actually survived the best? And what kind of patterns do we see today in America developed along the same lines? And throughout the history of the coastal plains, why did the Native Americans, do so well at thriving based on their diet or based on what they hunted would be one of the big reasons that you want to come away with that. One quick fact I want to show to you is in 1518, look, they had over 26 million people living in North America, and then by 1593, only about 80 years later, look at the drop. That's a lot of people that had passed, died because of disease, And I want you to take away of that the disease really impacted most of the Native American tribes, and that's why we have so many Native American tribes that are almost on the verge of being extinction in modern day today. Okay? Well, that ends my presentation. I hope you are able to watch it. I'll post this to probably tomorrow on Monday night, and hopefully you'll take some good notes because I'll explain to you what you got to do with a note taker with these particular things. These will not be Ed puzzles. Okay? All right. Well, have a great day, and we'll talk to you in the morning.